Western Canadian grower groups and the federal government have partnered on providing funding for wheat research to the tune of more than $20 million over 5 years.
Yesterday, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened Canada with, quote, severe fertilizer tariffs. That had some in the industry scratching their heads because he's been reducing these levies on fertilizer imports from this country.
Donald Trump just floated the idea of hitting Canada with severe fertilizer tariffs, and a lot of people in agriculture didn't know whether to laugh or panic. Not because tariffs are funny, but because the direction has been all over the place. One week, it's talk of easing pressure. The next, it's a threat that could land straight on the backs of prairie farmers and the companies that supply them. And while growers in Ottawa are busy putting real money into the future, like the new partnership funding more than $20 million in wheat research over 5 years, Washington is reminding everyone how exposed Canada can be when someone else controls the choke points. Here's the part most people miss. Canada has been a food superpower for a long time. Not in a headline way, but in a quiet, structural way. The prairies are not just pretty fields and long highways. They're the kind of place that keeps global shelves stocked. Wheat that stretches forever, canola that moves in rolling waves, and under Saskatchewan, potash reserves so massive, they support fertilizer systems around the world. The country has had the muscle. The problem was always the plumbing. For decades, Canadian grain and fertilizer moved through routes that made other people rich. Grain went west through Vancouver, a port that's crucial but regularly squeezed by congestion, labor disruptions, and rising costs. Huge volumes also went south first, through American rail networks and American ports, before touching international water. Fertilizer mined in Saskatchewan often traveled on U.S. infrastructure to reach global buyers, which meant tolls, fees, and leverage sitting outside Canada's hands. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was just the system. It was how it's done, until how it's done started looking like a liability. That's why early 2025 mattered. Mark Carney stood in front of Saskatchewan growers and asked a question that landed like a slap. Why does a country this rich still outsource its access to the world? Not outsource the farming, not outsource the mining, but outsource the ability to get its own product to buyers without passing through someone else's gate. That question hit at the exact same time trade threats from Washington started pointing directly at prairie livelihoods. Tariffs didn't just sound like politics anymore. They sounded like a bill due immediately. And once you see the exposure, you can't unsee it. The issue wasn't whether Canada produces enough. The issue was who gets to squeeze the line between Canada's production and the global market. So Canada started looking at something most people had forgotten. Churchill, before we go deeper, if you're into stories where economics, politics, and real-world infrastructure collide, you'll want to subscribe now because this is exactly the kind of shift that can change prices, jobs, and leverage for decades. Subscribing also helps more people find this breakdown, and it keeps you plugged into the next chapters as this trade map keeps evolving. Back to Churchill. The port of Churchill on Hudson Bay isn't some brand new idea. It was built in the 1930s as a shorter gateway to Europe. On a map, it's almost too obvious. Prairie rail lines running north. A port that can reach Atlantic shipping lanes with less distance than Vancouver routes, and a straight shot that can shave days off transit. For years, on paper, it looked like a cheat code. In reality, it was neglected. Underfunding kept operations limited and seasonal. Cargo volumes stayed low. By the late 20th century, people treated the port like a historic footnote, not a strategic asset. Then, in 1997, Ottawa sold the port and the 1,300 kilometers rail line to an American company, Omni. Investment slowed even more. Maintenance slipped. When floods damaged the rail line in 2017, Omni-Torex walked away, and Churchill went quiet. But in 2018, something unexpected happened. A coalition made up of 41 First Nations communities in northern Manitoba. Towns stepped in and bought the port and railway, forming the Arctic Gateway Group. It was meaningful, and it was bold. But most outsiders still didn't believe it would turn into major trade. People had heard revived Churchill stories before. The difference this time was the world around it changed. Shipping got more expensive. Vancouver's bottlenecks didn't magically disappear. American trade policy became less predictable, and climate change, for better or worse, began stretching the navigable season in Hudson Bay. The impossible started to look more like Leighton came March 2025, and the move that snapped everyone's attention into place. Genesis Fertilizers, a Saskatchewan company planning a large nitrogen fertilizer facility, announced a partnership with Arctic Gateway Group. The logic was simple and hard to argue with. Bring key inputs in through Churchill, ship finished product out through Churchill, and remove the U.S. middle steps entirely. Genesis projects producing about 1 million tons of fertilizer a year, and that kind of output requires massive inbound materials, including roughly 300,000 tons of phosphate imports. Traditionally, those flows pass through American routes. Under the new plan, they don't need to. Instead of relying on U.S. rail and U.S. ports, shipments can move into Hudson Bay and connect to Atlantic lanes more directly. That doesn't just cut distance, it cuts uncertainty. It reduces the number of hands on the wheel. And once that idea works for fertilizer, it immediately becomes bigger than fertilizer. Because Saskatchewan isn't just a farming province, it's a fertilizer heavyweight, and it sits on potash that the world depends on. Potash is not a niche commodity. It's one of the pillars holding up modern agriculture. When potash supply gets tight, yields drop, prices climb, and food insecurity spreads fast. Canada supplies roughly a third of the world's potash and controls a large share of global exports, with enormous reserves still underground. That's real leverage. But leverage only matters if you can deliver without someone else controlling the hallway. Grain makes the case even louder. Canada ships tens of millions of tons of grain a year, across wheat, canola, barley, oats, lentils, peas, and a long list of specialty crops. Wheat alone is a major export engine, and Canada's reputation for high-protein quality makes it a key supplier in many markets. Agricultural exports overall have grown into a massive number, and the trend line has been steadily up. By any measure, Canada is one of the most powerful food producers on the planet. Yet the travel route for those products still tells the dependent story. Vancouver handles huge volumes, but can become a pressure point when congestion hits. And when exports cross south into the United States before reaching ocean water, Canadian producers are effectively paying a toll to reach buyers. That toll isn't just money, it's exposure. If U.S. policy changes overnight, Canadian farmers and fertilizer producers can feel the shock without doing anything wrong. That's exactly why Trump's tariff threats hit harder than the headline. A proposed 25% levy on grain and new fees aimed at fertilizer exports aren't just numbers. They're a reminder that when you rely on someone else's infrastructure, their politics can become your problem. So the Churchill Plan expanded beyond one partnership. The idea isn't to replace Vancouver tomorrow. The idea is to build a second major outlet that Canada controls end to end, giving the country options and leverage. That's what the Port of Churchill Plus vision is about. Upgrading grain handling, expanding storage, improving loading systems, strengthening rail capacity, and making the whole pipeline reliable enough for serious volume. One of the biggest unlocks is time. Routes through Hudson Bay can save around 6 days to Europe compared to sending grain out through Vancouver. In shipping, days aren't a small detail. Days are money, spoilage risk, insurance costs, and the ability to hit better market timing. The more reliable the route, the more valuable that time becomes. But even more important than the days saved is the control gained. Grain grown in Saskatchewan can move on Canadian rail, load at a Canadian northern port, and reach European buyers without being routed through American systems. Same with key fertilizer inputs and shipments. The fees that used to flow south can stay in Canada. The decision-making power shifts back to domestic operators. Independence stops being a slogan and starts being logistics. This is where you'll hear the big number that keeps circulating. The idea that hundreds of billions of dollars in trade could shift over time. That figure isn't saying Canada's entire agricultural economy instantly changes lanes. It's describing the long-run value of trade that could realistically transition to Arctic routing over roughly a decade as capacity grows. Infrastructure upgrades land, and companies lock in new supply chain designs. Think about how it adds up. Potash exports alone are worth billions every year. Shift even part of that flow north over 10 years and the number climbs quickly. Add the slice of grain shipments to Europe and other markets where Hudson Bay routing makes sense. Add fertilizer imports and exports that currently ride U.S. networks. Layer in new categories too. like critical minerals from northern projects, and any future export corridors that depend on reliable domestic routes. Over a decade with growth, the totals can get very large very fast.